Hi, my name is Mei Trueba and I am a lecturer in global health at the University of Sussex. My research experience is focused around occupational health and development, mainly on how occupational health risks are constructed, how are they managed, and how can we improve the management and the understanding of health and safety. Today I will talk about mining, environment and health with a focus on low-middle income countries. Part 1, we will explore the relationship between mining and development. In Part 2, we will discuss and explore the relationship between mining and environmental health in particular. And in Part 3, we will explore the relationship between mining and occupational health. We will also discuss the implications for research, policy, and practice. First, I would like to discuss the mining-development link. The debates around whether mining contributes to development or not have a long history. There are a group of researchers that do seem to think that mining is actually good for development. Their ideas are based on the fact that economic development is a natural byproduct of mining activities. For instance, we have Eckert in 2001. As well, the defendants of this relationship as being positive, they conceptualize mining as an origin of cluster growth and for staple goods, meaning that functional specialization contributes to the creation of clusters, industrial clusters, will necessarily lead to economic development and growth, necessarily good for poverty eradication. Acknowledging some of the limitations and some of the problems that we can find in the relationship between mining and development, some other group of authors actually talk about the fact that mining can work for development as soon as the regulatory frameworks and institutions are in place. Amongst those authors and institutions, we have the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other researchers like Deferrati, O'Brien, McCahon, Oti. On the other side of the coin, we have the researchers that say that mining is actually not good for development and it increases poverty. Amongst those researchers, famous sentences like the paradox of plenty, such as Bevington in the University of Manchester, or researchers that make reference to the resource curse, which is a common label that makes reference to the negative outcomes that a country in possession of resources have in terms of decreased economic growth, increasing poverty and inequality, hindrance of democracy associated with outbreaks of conflicts and as well with corruption. What I would like to reflect on in here is whether this is two sides of the same coin. Research seems to be focused on whether mining contributes to development or whether mining does not contribute to development. I would like to think a bit forward about the issue and see it as two sides of the same coin. This is reflected, for instance, with this book that we have in this slide, America Latina, Private Wealth, Public Poverty. And I would like as well to reflect about the fact that mining has some local and national effects and some impacts at the other end of the commodity chain. So it is something just to break this kind of homogeneous way of looking, whether it contributes to development or not. There are inequalities involved. Those inequalities have been widely documented. For instance, world travelers such as Lindqvist. He traveled around the 1960s around Latin America, and finally he published a book of his trips, and one of the passages of his book reads, "The road between Potosi and Oruro crosses a mining landscape in ruins, abandoned and smelting surfaces, rusty conveyor belts, the relics of the exploitation of centuries. Everywhere the traces of former wealth. Left is simply a land of extreme poverty. Someone had been there, taken what they wanted, and decamped." This shows this need of exploring in more detail the relationship between mining and development. Various NGOs such as Oxfam America as well have discussed and have presenting this dichotomy, these two sides of the same coin, by saying, for instance, that when a foreign firm invests capital and employs relatively small amounts of local labor, most of the foreign exchange associated with the exports actually flows abroad, leaving poverty behind. In the same way as Lindqvist was pointing in his travel diaries. This is something that we can see all around the world. During my research in Bolivia, for instance, a series of conflicts associated with the poor benefits of mining for the local community resulted in 20 days of siege in the city I was doing my fieldwork. This picture, for instance, taken after days of social movements in the Cerro Rico in Potosí, represents local people's feeling that they are sitting on a golden chair, and yet they feel that Potosí is the cash cow that supports Bolivia and also the entire world, while Potosí remains poor and forgotten, against highlighting the negative impacts of mining for development. But this is not just in the case of the local dynamics. What happens at the local level can also be observed globally. For instance, just in terms of burden, about 3.9 billion people live in today's 56 mining countries, 90% of them in the low and middle income countries. Amongst the 3.5 billion people in these countries, about 1.5 billion live on less than $2 a day, which means that nearly up to 2/3 of the world's poorest population lives in mining countries. We can go back to the example of Bolivia, and in this slide, for instance, shows 52% of the Bolivian territory is covered by mineral resources. That's without taking into account petroleum and gas, just mineral resources in terms of silver, lead, tin. The map on the site indicates the poverty levels in the country. If we compare both maps, we can see that the poverty levels match the regions where mining takes place. In fact, the question of who benefits from mining and who doesn't, the haves and have-nots, has been long discussed. For instance, in this slide, we have examples of 3 books that explore the conflicts associated to that in detail. For instance, we have Linda Farthing and Benjamin Cole's Minero con Poder de Dinamita, translated into English, Will Be Miner with Dynamite Power. Benjamin tells The Price of Fire, about the resource wars and social movements in Bolivia as well. And we have Maria Lagos' book on We Were Forged This Way. An important point in comparing those 3 books is that the first one, Miner with Dynamite Power, it is the voice of the miners and how the lack of benefits from mining in their own daily lives encourage situations of conflict. The second one, Benjamin Dawes, explains in The Price of Fire how the lack of benefits from mining for the local population, not just the miners, but regional population, influence conflict. And the third one, Maria Lagos, explains how the lack of benefits from mining for the housewives of those miners and their relatives resulted in the organization of those housewives associations in order to try to change things. So in what sense does we can say that mining actually impacts or does not impact on development? In terms of taxation, in terms of universal health coverage, in terms of the revenues for government and the expenditure ability for health system development. Therefore, on the side of that, for welfare provision, unemployment benefits, maternity, pension. And in terms of the impacts that environmental pollution has over the health of population, necessary for governmental revenues. As well in terms of the uncertainties, in terms of the fluctuations of the prices. If economies are dependent on mineral production, when mineral prices go up and down, what does it happen for all the resources of the state and for people's livelihoods? And as well in terms of the historical and cumulative effects of mining, it's not just we are mining now, we have been doing that for centuries, and we have a history of ups and downs, uncertainties and conflicts, and how it impacts on the national and regional development at this point in time, together with the effects of conflict. So that will be in general a bit of the discussion of the development mining link. But then we need to think a bit forward. We need to think as well, what about the types of mining? We are discussing mining and development, and we are saying that there are inequalities in the benefits and the constraints for development. But do different types of mining actually influence in the same way or in different ways? We actually don't know, because there is no data researching those differences. In this slide, for instance, I have divided types of mining according to being large scale. That could be private, state-managed or joint ventures, for instance. Medium scale, that again can be private, state-managed or public-private partnerships. But then we have the so-called small-scale mining, which the definition changes between countries, but it can often be referred to those mining enterprises or associations or institutions with less than 100 workers. That includes cooperatives, small private mining, self-entrepreneurs, informal miners, and as well in the Latin American case, indigenous communitarian, which would be people that belongs to indigenous territories, they are rich in natural resources, therefore they are allowed by law to exploit the minerals. So then one thing that needs to be really explored when we assess the relationship between mining and development is in what ways do different types of mining actually impact on development or on poverty. But the fact is that although those different types of mining will have different impacts, necessarily they will have different impacts on poverty and development at the regional level and at the individual level, they actually act simultaneously. And it's very common that we will find the three types of mining, private, state, cooperative, indigenous, in the same region acting simultaneously. But it's important still to notice that each one of them have different health, environmental and development impacts. And there are many reasons for that. For instance, in this slide I have named some of them. For instance, those different types of mining have different economic impacts. They can invest in technologies, therefore they have different degrees of technological assets. From manual work, artisanal miners, to high technologies, innovative, that will prevent the risks of workers and environmental risks. They work different mineral deposits, usually state mining and large-scale private mining, they are able to pick the best mineral deposits, whilst cooperative miners, self-entrepreneurs, informal miners, they usually can take the leftovers. And the bargaining power of workers within those different types of miners is different. In some places they do not have, in some instances, they do not have this power to claim their rights. Even though legislations exist, they may not be applicable in certain circumstances. Corporate social responsibility is applied in different ways according to different miners. It is as well related to the economic assets and the technological assets. Another topic will be different regulations applied to different mining. It's not always the case, but it happens, but as well the pressures for compliance are different. It's as well a matter of the distinction of who has access to what type of mining, who can access. Clear differences in the access to employment, who accesses employment in the private sector, in the public sector, or in the informal sector. It is not equally distributed, it is not equal for everyone. Not everybody has the same opportunities to access. And that makes a huge difference in the terms of the contribution of mining to poverty. Since there is this problem of access to those livelihood opportunities, it creates inequality at the local level. There is always the issue as well of the vulnerability to fluctuating prices and market competitions. Usually large private mining will have projects overseas, so if something does not quite work in one context, they can always go into another one or sell the assets. That's not the case for cooperative miners or for small-scale miners. Finally, continuing in this line of further exploring the contribution between mining and development and the different factors and relations that one should be taking into account, there is the different mining processes or phases that we need to take into account. What kind of sections of the mining cycle are having what impacts on the population? And finally, in the same sense that different types of mining have different impacts for health, development, and environment, we need as well to take into account how the different mining processes or phases affect development or poverty through affecting the immediate environment and the health and safety of workers. We can divide those processes or phases according to exploration or extraction. Is it open? Is it underground? Is it water-based? What kind of mineral are we extracting? Is it silver? Is it coal? Each kind of type of extraction will have different impacts on the health of population. There will be different chemicals that workers will be faced with. On the second part of the mining process, we have the extraction or the transport. How is this mineral that has been extracted transported into the smelting, into the processing plants? Is it manually transported, like we can see in the picture like that I took during my fieldwork, or it is with technology and trucks? And what are the environmental impacts of this transport? Those minerals are transported into processing plants and smelter. What is involved in the smelting? What are the processing mechanisms? What chemicals are included in that? Is it done mechanically? Is it artisanally? And the final phase of the mining process will be the sale. We have a bit discussed the sale in terms of fluctuation of mineral prices, in taxes and revenues for the state, and how it is redistributed back into the population. As a key issue to take into account in this relationship between mining and development.